Welcome back. Controversial talks are taking place in Canada right now, with Parliament discussing whether disabled children could be euthanised by doctors. Now, this is part of Canada's assisted suicide scheme, known as medical assistance in dying. What a wonderful euphemism. Joining us now to discuss this is historian and journalist David Oldroyd-Bolt. David, tell us what medical assistance actually is, then.
What it really means is that the Canadian state will pay for you to off yourself if you decide that your life has no value to live. When this was brought in first in 2015, there were two criteria. One was that the death must be reasonably foreseeable, and the other was that there must be some medical reason behind it why you would wish to end your life. Then 5 years later, in 2020, Bill C-7 was introduced, which did away with both of those criteria. So essentially now in Canada, you could, if you were above the age of 18, apply to be paid for to be killed by the state, which the state had a great impetus to do, because it only cost them $2,300, whereas Canada has one of the lowest social care budgets in the world, so they were very much interested in pushing these costs down. And we saw, for instance, that the debate suggested that in the first 5 years of medical assistance in dying, MAID as it's known, they saved about $90 million, and that if they brought in these further reductions of criteria, there'd be another saving of $60 million. So a lot of the conversation in Canada has been about the medical savings here. There's been very little conversation about, for instance, that people who are long-term homeless are being pressured into this. There has been practically no discussion on Canada's main state broadcaster about any of the possible abuses of this system, nor of the fact that the legislation coming through will eventually allow for children aged 14 to 17 to euthanise themselves. This whole debate is being framed around lowering of costs and about freedom, a freedom of choice to euthanise yourself, to kill yourself.
So this, I mean, that's what they see it as, a fundamental human right. But really, it's just for them to essentially save money.
Yes.
And what about the moral implications? Is anybody raising that?
Not very many, because a great deal of the broadcasting networks in Canada are funded by the state, and they are directly disincentivised from talking about these things. There is a great progressive movement that makes what progressive movement we have here look very timid. And within part of that progressive credo is the idea that everybody should have the right to die when they choose. And the fact that it is being used to euthanize people who are, frankly, able to carry on living if only they had some support, whether medical support or social support, is practically not discussed. And so when anybody in this country uses, as they very often do, advocates for euthanasia, use Canada as the example, people really need to be aware of what that means. And, for instance, when 2015, when this was brought into law by the Supreme Court specifically in Canada said that they did not give any credence to the slippery slope argument that the advocates against euthanasia were making. Well, we've been shown pellucidly over the past 7 years that not only is it a slippery slope, it's a slope into hell.
Wow. And do you think that that could end up impacting the UK in any way? Well,
I think it could, because parallels are often drawn between the English-speaking countries of the world and their social progression. So, you know, if something happens in the States or in Canada, Australia or New Zealand, there are very often arguments made by progressives here that, look, these are the other civilised English-speaking countries of the world, we should follow them. Well, perhaps people making those arguments should, A, look at the reality of Canada, and B, look at the other two countries where euthanasia is legalised and has been for quite some time, Belgium and the Netherlands. And in both of those countries, there is now practically no limit on the conditions under which you can euthanise yourself. And indeed, there has just, in October, there's been a case in the European Court of Human Rights. A Belgian man called Tom Mortier discovered in 2012 that his mother had been euthanised without any consultation with her family. She was 64 years old, had suffered from clinical depression.
Actually, we covered this on the show about a month ago.
He only found this out when his wife received a phone call saying, please come and collect your late mother-in-law's things. Wow. There are now discussions in the Netherlands that there should be no lower legal limit on the age at which children can be euthanised. And indeed, a Dutch campaigner said that he believes that by 2023 there will be absolutely no limit on this. The Canadian bill that is being discussed brings this to the front and centre. If parents have children who are found to have congenital diseases or diseases that would affect their quality of life, those children could be euthanised by their parents. This is infanticide being encouraged by progressives, so-called, in Canada.
I mean, it sounds unbelievable. It also has, I hate bringing up Hitler, but it's got that resonance there.
It's directly there, yeah.
Do you, though, think that there are conditions where people can take their own lives?
I've had this discussion many, many times with medical practitioners in this country, and they have all in their careers, whether they be long or short careers, have seen instances where people are really suffering at the end of life. And they make this case, I think, with a perfectly good conscience that that is inhumane. The problem is that in every single instance of euthanasia being legalised in any single country, these abuses occur. And there is practically nothing to stop them. I mean, for instance, there is always brought up here the idea that there would need to be two separate medical diagnoses confirming that that person is suffering greatly and therefore should be allowed to euthanize himself. This is the Belgian system. And indeed, that was the case. But in the most recent reforms to the Belgian law, though those two doctors may make this decision, the person carrying out the euthanasia, killing the patient at his or her request, can totally disregard that. So these legal safeguards that are put in place will never last. This is the same thing has happened in the Netherlands, the same thing has happened in Canada. Any legal safeguard will never be enough because the twofold campaign to have greater freedom to die, and of course the campaign saying this is actually saving money, though it will never be as overt as the former, will, I think, overcome any medical objections and will overcome any moral objections. This is a terrible, terrible thing that's happening in some of the most civilised and most developed countries in the world, and we here seem to be oblivious of it, despite the argument gaining more and more traction.
Because there is a euthanasia bill being discussed right now in Hollywood, right? Yeah?
Yes, in this private member's bill in the Scottish Parliament. Nicola Sturgeon has twice before voted against this, as did Ruth Davidson, then leader of the Scottish Conservatives. Ruth Davidson has subsequently said that she only voted against this out of, as she put it, cowardice, and Nicola Sturgeon has said that she is beginning to think twice about this. I do not think that this is something that Scotland alone can be allowed to make a decision upon. It's one of the great evils of devolution, that one part of the United Kingdom, as it's also doing with its self-identification bill for transgender people, could become, as it were, a haven for people from England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I think once you start going down the route that you have fundamentally different ethical laws within parts of the United Kingdom, you fracture that kingdom beyond repair. And as a unionist, I don't want to see that. And I think, as moral beings, we should not want to see that. We should not want there to be one constituent part of the United Kingdom which has legalised death.
Yeah, we don't want Canada north of our border, if you've ever been to Canada. So that was an incredibly depressing but very, very interesting topic. I hadn't really read much about it until very recently, and it seems like it's another front line in the so-called being kind, but, with unbelievable ramifications. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about it.
Thanks, Josh.